Why is Africa so poor, despite being so rich in natural resources? To understand the depth of this paradox, let's travel back in time for a moment. Imagine the 10th century. The Emperor Musa ruled the West African Empire of Mali. His wealth was so legendary that he is still considered one of the wealthiest people in human history. During his pilgrimage to Mecca, he spent so much gold that he crashed its price throughout the Middle East for an entire decade. Caravans of thousands of people, camels loaded with tons of pure gold. This was Africa, a synonym for fabulous abundance, a real King Midas in reality. Now, let's return to the present day. What image comes to mind for most people when they hear the word Africa? Unfortunately, more often than not, it's not palaces of gold, but heartbreaking images of humanitarian aid, emaciated people with empty eyes being fed by charity workers. This image, propagated by the media, has become so familiar that it obscures everything else. And here's the central paradox. Africa holds about 30% of all the world's mineral reserves. It has 40% of the world's gold and 90% of its platinum and chromium. The continent possesses the world's largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, and uranium. It accounts for 12% of global oil reserves and 8% of natural gas. And that's not all. Africa also has 65% of all arable land on the planet, land suitable for agriculture. It seems impossible to lose with such cards in hand. But on the other hand, there's the harsh reality. According to the latest World Bank data, the extreme poverty rate in sub-Saharan Africa in 2022 was a shocking 45.5%. According to the UN, in 2025, more than 3/4 of all people living in extreme poverty on the planet will be in this region. This paradox extends to food. With nearly 2/3 of the world's arable land, the continent cannot feed itself. In 2024, according to the UN, 307 million Africans faced hunger, and this number, unfortunately, continues to rise in most regions. Why doesn't the wealth of the subsoil translate into the wealth of the people? Why does land capable of yielding abundant harvests leave its people hungry? This is the mystery we will try to unravel today. Ghosts of the past, the colonial legacy, and its ambiguous role. When we look for those responsible for Africa's troubles, the first and most obvious answer that comes to mind is colonialism. And there is certainly a huge amount of truth in that. Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, in his famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, put forward a powerful thesis. The West did not simply develop in parallel with Africa, it developed at Africa's expense. The relationship between colonizer and colony was parasitic by nature. Resources, from ivory and rubber to diamonds and human lives, were extracted from the continent for centuries to enrich European metropolises. But perhaps the most terrible and long-lasting legacy of colonialism is not the wealth that was taken away, but what remained after the colonizers left: artificial borders. At the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century, European powers literally drew the map of Africa with a ruler, paying no attention to where different peoples lived, what language they spoke, or what their cultural ties were. As a result, some ethnic groups were divided by new borders, while others, historically at odds, were locked into the same state. The most tragic example of the consequences of such cartographic creativity is Rwanda. Before the arrival of Europeans, Tutsi and Hutu were more social groups than warring tribes. But the Belgian colonial authorities, following the principle of divide and conquer, decided to rely on the Tutsi ethnic minority. They introduced identity cards indicating ethnicity, turning flexible social categories into rigid racial ones. The Tutsi received privileges and access to power, while the Hutu, who made up the majority, found themselves in a subordinate position. This sowed the seeds of deep hatred, which reaped a terrible harvest in 1994. The genocide, which claimed the lives of nearly 1 million people, was a direct and horrific consequence of this colonial and social engineering. It would seem that everything is clear. Colonialism is the root of all evil. But if everything were so simple, why have some former colonies been able to escape this curse, while others have not? History is not a sentence. There are examples that make us look at the problem more broadly. Take Singapore. This tiny state, like many African countries, was a British colony. In 1965, when Singapore gained independence, it was a poor place with no natural resources, where only half the population could read and write. But in just a few decades, thanks to competent planning, strict discipline, and a focus on education, Singapore has become one of the richest Asian tigers and a thriving financial center in the world. Moreover, there are successful examples in Africa itself. Take Botswana. At the time of independence, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. But the discovery of diamond deposits, combined with a wise and non-corrupt government, has turned it into a model of stability and economic growth on the continent. Or Mauritius, an island nation that has been able to move away from dependence on a single crop, sugarcane, and build a diversified economy based on tourism, textiles, and now financial services and technology. The Seychelles, focusing on elite tourism, have achieved the highest GDP per capita in Africa. These examples show that a colonial past is a severe trauma and an extremely unfavorable starting position, but not a final verdict. It sets a certain default path, a path of weak institutions, internal conflicts, and an economy focused on exporting raw materials. But this path can be deviated from. The key factor is not the fact of colonization itself, but what institutions of power and society the country was able to build after gaining independence. And here we come to the very heart of the problem: the resource curse, or the curse of governance. There is a popular theory called the resource curse. It sounds paradoxical, but the essence is that an abundance of natural resources, instead of becoming a blessing, often becomes a real curse for a country. It provokes conflicts, fuels corruption, and ultimately hinders economic development. The most striking and sad example is the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is estimated that its subsoil hides minerals worth over $24 trillion. It is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of raw materials, but its people are among the poorest on the planet. The wealth of the earth has become a bone of contention for countless armed groups, foreign corporations, and corrupt officials, while ordinary people do not see a cent from these trillions. But what if it's not so much about the resources themselves as about how they are managed? More and more experts are inclined to believe that Africa is suffering not from a resource curse, but from a curse of governance. This is a complex and self-sustaining cycle consisting of corruption, misguided political decisions, and external pressure that prevent wealth from working for the benefit of the people. Let's get down to earth from the level of high theory. This is a real case. Imagine an entrepreneur in Zimbabwe. He founded a successful car repair shop. A few years later, men in suits came to him and demanded 50% of the business in exchange for help in processing documents in government agencies. After threats and pressure, he was forced to give up 25%. Similar stories are told in Nigeria and South Africa, where the so-called construction mafia demands its share of every project, and the police are powerless to do anything. This is not just banditry. It is a symptom of a deep disease, state capture, when the state apparatus itself ceases to serve society and works in the interests of a narrow group of people. Or another example from Zimbabwe, Strive Masiyiwa, the founder of the telecommunications company Econet, spent 5 years just registering his business because he refused to pay bribes. In the end, he had to flee the country. Now compare this to the story of Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, who became billionaires in 5 years. It's not that there are no talented entrepreneurs in Africa. The problem is that the system stifles them, taking away any incentive to develop. Why build a company if a significant part of it can be taken away from you at any moment? This problem manifests itself at the highest level. Consider Nigeria, the largest oil producer in Africa. Cases against former high-ranking officials, such as former oil minister Diazani Alison Madueke, are linked to the theft of billions of dollars. But often, such cases end in plea bargains when corrupt officials get away with returning part of what they stole and avoid serious prison terms. This undermines people's faith in justice and creates an atmosphere of permissiveness for the elite. Added to this are the failed economic models that many countries chose after gaining independence. Experiencing deep distrust of their former colonizers, many African leaders became carried away with the ideas of African socialism and Marxism. Instead of opening economies to trade and investment, they followed a path of protectionism, closing their markets. This, combined with inefficient governance, has led to stagnation and missed opportunities. And here, another complex and ambiguous player enters the scene: foreign aid. Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo, in her sensational book Dead Aid, argues that over the past 50 years, more than $1 trillion of aid has been poured into Africa, but this has not led to sustainable growth. On the contrary, in her opinion, this aid has become another easy resource for which corrupt elites fight. It corrupts officials, alienating them from the needs of their own people. After all, the money will come from the West anyway. Why develop your economy and collect taxes? It creates dependence and undermines local markets. Imagine that thousands of tons of clothing are imported into a country for free. Local garment factories immediately go bankrupt. The aid goes away, and with it, jobs and skills. Of course, it cannot be said that all aid is evil. There are striking examples of success. The American PEPFAR program has saved millions of lives in the fight against HIV and AIDS. The efforts of the international community have helped stop the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. The problem is not with the aid itself, but with its model. When it turns into endless infusions without control and without a development strategy, it becomes part of the problem. This whole system, easy money from resources, large-scale corruption, ineffective aid, creates a kind of extractive symbiosis. The state, instead of creating conditions for the prosperity of its citizens, turns into a machine for extracting rent, whether it be oil rent, diamond rent, or aid rent. And there is no place for the common person in this system. Added to this is the debt trap. By 1996, the continent owed about $321 billion, and that was just the interest on the debt. And the cherry on top is capital flight. From 1970 to 2008 alone, $700 billion was withdrawn from 33 sub-Saharan countries. It turns out that the continent is bleeding on both sides. It gets into debt and at the same time loses huge funds that could have been used for its development. Land, geography, and climate, when nature is both friend and foe. Even if ideal governments were to suddenly reign in Africa, they would have to face challenges that do not depend on human will. Geography and climate are fundamental factors that create enormous difficulties for development, and poor management only exacerbates them many times over. First, geography. Look at the map. The vast Sahara Desert effectively cuts off most of the continent from the historical trade routes connecting Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. This has hampered the economic and cultural development of the regions south of the Sahara for centuries. making them more isolated and vulnerable. In addition, Africa has more landlocked countries than any other continent. For such a country, the cost of transporting goods, that is, imports and exports, automatically increases, making its economy less competitive. Second, the land. We have already said that Africa has 65% of the world's arable land. But why can't it feed itself? The answer lies in the fact that a significant part of this land, especially in the center and south of the continent, is actually infertile. These are the so-called ancient soils, from which almost all nutrients have been washed out over millions of years. To make them productive, modern agricultural technologies, fertilizers, and huge investments are needed, which most small farmers simply do not have. This is why Africa has not had its own green revolution, which in the mid-20th century transformed agriculture in Asia and Latin America. Added to this is another serious institutional problem, the land tenure system. In most African countries, land historically belongs not to individuals, but to communities or tribes. A farmer who cultivates his plot often does not have clear and legally established ownership rights. And what's the point of investing money in improving the land, in irrigation, if you're not sure that this land won't be taken away from you tomorrow? The lack of private ownership of land is a colossal brake on the development of large-scale commercial agriculture. As a result, according to some reports, about 30 African countries today produce less food per capita than in the 1960s. Nigeria, once a major exporter of food, has become its largest importer. Finally, climate. Africa, which has contributed the least to global warming, suffers from its consequences the most. The continent is warming faster than the global average. Droughts are becoming more severe and prolonged, and floods are becoming more destructive. The World Meteorological Organization's 2023 report paints a bleak picture: record heat in North Africa, catastrophic floods in Libya, Kenya, and Somalia that claimed thousands of lives, and the worst drought in Zambia in 40 years. These climate cataclysms cost the countries of the continent 205% of their GDP annually, and the costs of adapting to the new conditions are estimated at tens of billions of dollars a year. It turns out that geography and climate act as multipliers of problems. In a country with a strong and effective government, poor soils and drought are complex challenges that can be overcome with science, technology, and investment. But in a country with a weak, corrupt government, these same challenges turn into insurmountable barriers, dooming millions of people to hunger and poverty. New horizons. Who is building the future of Africa? After all that has been said, it may seem that there is no way out of this vicious circle, but that is not the case. The most interesting and encouraging processes in Africa are happening right now, and their driving force is not external aid, but the internal energy of the continent itself. To understand what the future may hold, let's look at those who have already succeeded. We mentioned Botswana, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. What is the secret of their success? It's not just luck or the availability of resources. It's the result of concrete, correct decisions. In Botswana, income from diamonds was not plundered, but purposefully invested in creating strong and non-corrupt state institutions in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. They protected private property, which attracted investors. Mauritius is simply a textbook example of diversification. Instead of eternally depending on sugarcane, they used income from it to create export zones, attracting foreign companies to produce textiles. Then, they focused on tourism, and then on financial services and IT. The key factors were pragmatic, results-based policies, and constant dialogue between the state and business. The Seychelles, opening an international airport in 1971, turned their natural beauty into their main economic asset, competently developing the tourism industry. The lessons of these countries show that there is a way out, and it lies through building strong institutions, protecting investments, and having a smart, long-term strategy. But most importantly, a new economy is emerging in Africa today, which can be called post-resource. Its main capital is not what can be dug out of the ground, but what is born in people's heads. Look at the technology boom. Cities such as Lagos in Nigeria, Nairobi in Kenya, and Cape Town in South Africa have become real silicon savannas. They attract billions of dollars in venture capital investments. Lagos has given birth to fintech unicorns. That is, startups with a valuation of more than $1 billion, such as Flutterwave and Paga, which process payments across the continent. Nairobi has spawned the revolutionary mobile money system M-Pesa, which has changed the lives of millions of people who have never had a bank account. This economy is built on intelligence, not minerals. Or take cultural expansion. The Nigerian film industry, Nollywood, is second in the world in terms of the number of films produced after India's Bollywood. It creates hundreds of thousands of jobs and contributes billions to the country's GDP. But more importantly, it exports Nigerian culture around the world. And the musical genre of Afrobeats. Nigerian artists such as Burna Boy, Wizkid, and Davido gather stadiums in London and New York. Their tracks dominate global charts. This is soft power, which has a quite hard economic effect and changes the perception of Africa on the planet. China, a new global player, fits into this complex picture. Its role is ambiguous. On the one hand, China has become Africa's largest trading partner. It builds roads, ports, and railways that the continent desperately needs. On the other hand, this trade often has the same colonial character. Raw materials from Africa, finished industrial goods to Africa, and Chinese loans for infrastructure projects increase the debt burden on African countries. China is neither a savior nor a new colonizer. It is a powerful force that simultaneously carries both huge opportunities and serious risks, and African countries will have to learn to use the former and minimize the latter. Finally, the main resource of the future, which can outweigh all the problems, is people. You have probably heard of the demographic dividend. It's not just a lot of young people. It's a special period in a country's history when the number of people of working age significantly exceeds the number of dependents, children, and the elderly. If at this moment the economy is growing and creating jobs, there is an explosive growth in well-being. Europe, America, and Asia have already passed through this stage. Africa is just approaching its demographic window, which is forecast to open after 2050. But this is not an automatic bonus. It is only potential. To realize it, it is necessary to invest colossal funds in the education and healthcare of these young people today. If this is not done, the demographic dividend may turn into a demographic bomb. Millions of unemployed and unsettled young people. All these new trends, technological hubs, cultural expansion, successful management models, point to a fundamental shift. Africa is beginning to find paths to prosperity that do not depend on cursed resources. The new definition of wealth for the continent is not its subsoil, but its talented, young, and energetic people. And such an economy, based on human capital, can be the best cure for the curse of governance. After all, if the main source of income for the state is taxes from successful citizens and companies, then the authorities have a direct incentive to invest in these citizens and create conditions for their success. The interests of the authorities and the people finally coincide. Rewriting African history. The main cause of poverty in Africa is not one thing, but a complex of factors. a difficult historical heritage, problems with governance, and difficult geographical conditions. However, the situation is changing. Today, successful examples such as Botswana, Mauritius, and Côte d'Ivoire show that competent political leadership and economic policies can overcome these difficulties. The future of the continent is determined by its own internal development, innovation, entrepreneurship, and culture, not by external forces. A new Africa is being born right now, thanks to the talent of its people, who may soon become the continent's main export commodity.